Winifred Sullivan had lived alone on the Kansas plains for nearly 2 years before she finally admitted to herself that she had no idea what August Ford had been doing every single time he showed up at her door with a smile on his face and something useful in his hands. It was the spring of 1878 when she finally understood, and the realization hit her with the force of a prairie thunderstorm, sudden, unavoidable, and leaving everything in its wake looking entirely different than it had before. But to understand that moment, you had to go back to the very beginning, back to the hot August afternoon when Winifred first arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with 2 trunks of belongings, a deed to 40 acres of dry grassland, and a grief so heavy it had settled into her bones like winter cold that refused to leave even after the season had turned. She was 26 years old, recently widowed, and entirely alone. Her husband, Patrick Sullivan, had died of a fever in March of that year, leaving her the small plot of land he had purchased sight unseen from a land office in St. Louis. Patrick had been full of dreams, big, open, sprawling dreams about cattle and crops and building something from nothing in the newly opened territories. He had spoken of Kansas the way some men spoke of heaven, with a reverence that made you believe something magnificent waited there just beyond the reach of ordinary days. Winifred had believed him. She had loved him with the uncomplicated certainty of a woman who had married young and happily, and when he was gone, she had stood at his grave in the Missouri churchyard and made a promise to a man who could no longer hear her. She had promised to go to Kansas, to build what he had dreamed about, to not let the fever that stole him also steal every plan he had ever made. She was not a woman who broke promises, even ones made to the dead. So she packed her trunks, sold their small house in St. Louis for enough money to outfit herself for a year, and boarded a train heading west. When she stepped off the stage in Caldwell with the late August heat pressing down on her like a flat iron, she had precisely one name written on a scrap of paper in her reticule, a property agent named Harold Gibbs, who was supposed to give her the key to a small homestead cabin and point her in the direction of her 40 acres. Harold Gibbs had indeed done both those things, though with considerably less enthusiasm than she had hoped. He was a small, damp-looking man who sweated through everything and seemed personally offended by the existence of female landowners. "It ain't much of a spread," he had told her flatly, tucking her payment receipt into his desk drawer as though he wanted to hide the evidence of the transaction. "You'll need neighbors to help you get through the first winter. You got any family coming?" "No," Winifred had said. He had looked at her with something between pity and irritation. "Then you'd best get acquainted with the folks out on Sutter's Creek Road real quick. There's a good community out there. The Davenports, the Holloways, a few others, and August Ford runs the biggest spread on that road. Fine cattleman. He'll be your nearest neighbor, about a mile north of your property." "I appreciate the information," she had said, in a tone that made it clear she had not asked for his opinion on whether she could manage alone. She had driven herself out to the property in a rented wagon, unlocked the cabin door, and stood in the single room that smelled of dust and old wood and something faintly animal, and she had breathed in slowly and told herself this was the beginning and not the end. It took her 3 days to make the cabin habitable, hauling water from the creek herself, scrubbing the floor until it gave up the worst of its grime, airing the single window and the door until the smell faded into something merely old rather than something actively unpleasant. She had a small cook stove, a narrow bed, a table and 2 chairs, and the particular fierce satisfaction of a woman who has accomplished something difficult without any assistance whatsoever. It was on that 3rd evening, just as the sun was sliding down behind the flat horizon and painting everything amber and deep rose, that she heard a horse and looked up from the garden plot. She was planning to see a man riding toward her property along the dirt road. He pulled up at her fence line and took off his hat, and she got her first good look at August Ford. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that was a little too long and needed the attention of a barber, and a face that was tanned so deeply by the Kansas sun that his light gray eyes looked startling by contrast, like two pieces of sky caught in a leather setting. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with the kind of lean, capable look that men got when they worked outdoors all their lives and never spent a day sitting still. There was a warmth in his expression that she noticed even from a distance, something open and genuine that she did not quite trust yet, because she had been making her own way in a skeptical world for long enough to know that openness in a stranger could mean many different things. "Evening," he said, staying at the fence line, not pushing through it or assuming an invitation. She noticed that. "I'm August Ford. I've got the ranch a mile up the road. Just wanted to come introduce myself and see if you were settling in all right." "Winifred Sullivan," she said, walking toward the fence but stopping a careful few feet back from it. "I'm settling fine, thank you," he nodded, turning his hat slowly in his hands. "Harold Gibbs mentioned a new landowner was taking the place. If you need anything at all, tools, advice about the well, someone to talk through the fence lines with, you come on up to the ranch. My foreman, Elias Crane, knows this land about as well as anybody. We're happy to help." "That is very kind," she said. "I don't anticipate needing much help, but I'm grateful for the offer." He smiled at that, and something about the smile was unexpectedly warm without being condescending, which she had been bracing herself for. "Good evening then, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and settled his hat back on his head and turned his horse north along the road, and that was that. She watched him ride away and thought, neighborly. He seemed like a neighborly man, the kind of steady, decent presence that a small rural community depended on to function. She filed him away under useful neighbor and went back to studying her garden plot. That opinion sustained itself without any particular challenge for the first several weeks, which was how long it took before August Ford first came to her door with something in his hands. It was a mid-September morning, cool and clear in the way that early Kansas autumn liked to be, and she was struggling with the second fence post on the south side of her property, trying to drive it deep enough into the dry ground to hold properly. She had been at it for an hour, and the post was resisting her with a stubbornness that felt nearly personal. She heard the hoofbeats and looked up to see August Ford coming down the road with a large coil of barbed wire balanced across his saddle. He stopped at the fence line again. She noted he always stopped there, never assumed he was welcome through it, and tipped his hat. "I was bringing some extra wire to a neighbor down the road," he said. "Thought you might be able to use some, given you've got those fence posts going in." He was offering wire, and wire was not cheap, and she was absolutely going to need it. Winifred Sullivan was practical above almost everything else. She thanked him, accepted the wire, and offered him coffee, which was the natural and proper thing to do when a neighbor brought you something useful. He tied his horse, came through the gate, and sat at her small table while she made coffee on the stove, and they talked about fence lines and the proper way to set posts in hard clay soil and the likelihood of the fall being as dry as the summer had been. He had useful things to say about all of it. He finished his coffee, thanked her for it in a way that seemed genuinely pleased, and then went on his way. Neighborly, she thought again, watching the dust settle on the road behind him. In October, he appeared with a recommendation for the best feed store in Caldwell and a jar of his housekeeper's apple preserves, which she felt strongly that she could not refuse since the woman had apparently made extra and was in the habit of sharing them with half the county anyway. In early November, when the first cold snapped down out of the north like a jaw closing, he arrived with a load of seasoned firewood from his own stores because, he explained simply, he had too much of it cut and his woodshed would barely hold more. "I certainly can't take your firewood," she said, standing in her doorway with her arms crossed against the cold. "You'd be doing me a favor," he said, already lifting logs from the wagon bed with an ease that made it look weightless. "I've got Elias and 3 other hands with nothing particular to do on a slow afternoon. We'll stack it by your lean-to and be out of your way in 20 minutes. She watched 3 men unload and stack an amount of firewood that would have taken her a week to collect and process, and August Ford did his share right alongside them. And when they were done, he accepted a cup of coffee again and sat at her table again, and they talked about the coming winter and the price of cattle, and what she planned to do with her 40 acres come spring. She told him about Patrick, about the dream her husband had carried west with him even when his body didn't follow. She didn't know why she told him. Something about August Ford made conversation feel natural and unguarded in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. He listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and when she finished he said, "That's a fine thing, honoring what he wanted. This land is worth believing in." She believed him, and she went to sleep that night feeling, for the first time since arriving in Kansas, that she was not entirely alone in the enterprise of surviving here. December brought a snowstorm that rattled the cabin walls and piled drifts against the door, and on the second day of it, August Ford appeared on horseback with a wrapped bundle of salt pork and dried beans and cornmeal from his stores. He said the road between their properties was barely passable, and he'd been concerned about whether her provisions were holding. She had plenty of provisions, she told him, because she was not a woman who went into winter unprepared. He nodded, looking genuinely relieved, and she let him warm himself by her stove before the ride back. She thought, he is a good man, a genuinely decent, neighborly man. And she was grateful for it without reading anything further into it at all. January slid into February, cold and relentless and white, and she spent those months reading every book she had brought with her, writing letters to her sister in Ohio, learning the particular sounds the prairie made at night in winter. The way the wind moved differently when the temperature dropped, the silence that happened just before snow. She thought about Patrick less often now, and when she thought of him the grief was less a fresh wound and more a permanent scar, always there but no longer bleeding. She took this as progress. In early February, her mare, Ruth, threw a shoe and went slightly lame, and Winifred was trying to figure out how to get Ruth to Caldwell's farrier without making the lameness worse when August Ford appeared at the fence line on a Tuesday morning with a look of concern. "She's favoring that left front," he said, nodding at Ruth in the small paddock. "I know," Winifred said. "I need to get her to the farrier, but I don't want to walk her the full distance on it." "Jim Tackett's the best farrier in the county," he said. "He comes out to my place the third Tuesday of every month. That's next week. I can ask him to swing by here first if you'd like." She agreed, because it was the practical solution, and not because she had any particular feeling about it one way or another. Jim Tackett came the following Tuesday and put a new shoe on Ruth and charged Winifred a fair price, and refused the $1 she tried to add as a tip, telling her that Mr. Ford had already settled up with him. She went directly to August Ford's ranch the next morning and paid him back the full amount and a few cents more, and she said it plainly. She did not want to be indebted to any man for anything, and she was not in the habit of accepting gifts. He took the money without argument or offense, which she respected enormously, and he said, "That's a good policy." "I meant it just as convenience, not charity." "I know," she said, "and I appreciate both the distinction and the arrangement." She drove home from his ranch in her small wagon and thought that she liked him, genuinely liked him, the way you liked a well-made tool or a reliable piece of equipment. He was steady and useful, and he didn't make anything complicated. Spring arrived on the plains like a promise being kept, sudden and extravagant and green, and with it came the reality of actually working her 40 acres. Winifred had been thinking through the planting plan all winter, studying the farming guides she had ordered from St. Louis, asking questions of everyone in Caldwell who would talk to her. She had settled on a plan for a kitchen garden supplemented by a modest grain crop, along with expanding the small paddock to keep a few more animals. She was out marking her grain rows one April morning when she heard the particular sound of a wagon coming from the north, and looked up to see August Ford with Elias Crane on the seat beside him and 3 men on horseback behind, and a wagon loaded with seed, and what appeared to be a hand plow. She put her hands on her hips and waited. August climbed down from the wagon with an expression that was carefully neutral, which she had come to recognize as the face he wore when he expected to be argued with. "I know you didn't ask," he said immediately, "but Elias and I looked at your soil last fall when we fixed the fence line on the north side, and it's got a particular clay layer about 6 inches down that's going to break 2 plows before you figure out the right angle. This plow's designed for it. And these are the seed varieties that do best in this particular soil." He paused. "You can say no and I'll take it all back. I just thought it was useful information and useful equipment, and I'd rather bring it than not." She looked at the equipment. She looked at August Ford. She thought about the practical reality of breaking a plow on a clay layer in the middle of the planting season. "What do I owe you for the seed?" she asked. They settled on a fair price, and she paid it immediately from the coffee tin she kept her money in. He and his men spent one morning helping her set the rows, and Elias Crane did indeed know exactly how to angle the plow blade against that clay layer, and she paid attention to every single thing he did so that she would know how to do it herself the next time. August Ford had coffee at her table again that afternoon, and they talked for nearly 2 hours about farming and the cattle market, and whether the railroad expansion would change the shape of the county, and she found herself completely comfortable in a conversation with a man for the first time since Patrick died. That was a thing she noticed but did not examine too closely. Through April and into May, he came by twice a week on average. Sometimes he had something with him, a tool, information about a market in Caldwell, news about the weather patterns expected that month. Sometimes he simply said he was passing by and stopped to check on the progress of her crops, and they would walk the rows together, and he would point out things she had not noticed, and she would point out things she understood better than he did, which gave her quiet satisfaction and seemed to genuinely please him. Her sister Alina, who wrote faithfully from Ohio, began asking pointed questions in her letters. "You mentioned this Mr. Ford quite a bit," Alina wrote in May. "He sounds like a fine neighbor. How old is he? Is he married?" Winifred wrote back, "He is approximately 30 years old. He is not married. His wife died 4 years ago from a difficult childbirth, and he is a fine neighbor. That is the extent of what I have to report." Alina wrote back, "Are you certain that is the extent of it?" Winifred did not reply to that particular sentence. It was in May that she met Ruth Ann Davenport, who lived 2 miles south on Sutter's Creek Road with her husband Thomas and their 4 children. Ruth Ann was a compact, energetic woman of 32 with bright dark eyes, and the kind of cheerful practicality that Winifred found deeply appealing. And they became friends with the quick, decisive speed of women who recognized in each other someone worth knowing. Ruth Ann came to call the first Sunday of June, which was a quiet social habit in the community on days when the work slowed enough to allow it, and she sat in Winifred's single good chair and drank coffee, and asked about the crops and the cabin and what Winifred thought of Caldwell generally. And then, with the same comfortable directness with which she approached everything else, she said, "I notice August Ford comes by rather often." "He's a good neighbor," Winifred said, refilling the coffee cups. Ruth Ann gave her a look that was so eloquent it needed no words to accompany it. "He is genuinely just being neighborly," Winifred said. "He's helped half the people on this road at one point or another. That's simply his character." Ruth Ann picked up her coffee cup with the expression of a woman who was choosing, very deliberately, not to say what she was thinking. She was silent for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "He has never in the 4 years I have lived on this road brought me barbed wire, firewood, seed, a plow, a farrier, or apple preserves." Winifred opened her mouth. "Or had coffee at my table 12 times, Ruth Ann added. "I haven't counted," Winifred said. "I have," said Ruth Ann with great cheerfulness and drank her coffee. Winifred thought about this conversation for 3 days, and then decided that Ruth Ann was a lovely woman with a slightly overactive imagination, and an obvious fondness for romantic interpretation. August Ford was a decent man who believed in community and mutual support, and there was nothing more complicated than that occurring on Sutter's Creek Road. She nearly convinced herself. June was warm and generous, and her crops were coming in better than she had dared to hope, green and determined in the Kansas soil. She was beginning to feel genuinely competent here, beginning to feel the specific quiet pride of someone who had been tested and had not broken. She was sleeping well, eating well, writing longer letters to a leaner, and feeling the particular satisfaction of a woman who had built something real with her own hands. On a Tuesday morning in the middle of June, she went into Caldwell to sell the first of her surplus kitchen vegetables at the market and buy several things she needed for the cabin. The market in Caldwell was held in the broad dirt square outside the general store, run by a man named Persimmon Hayes, who was 60 and had opinions about everything, and kept them well stocked on all their necessaries. She was tying her wagon at the rail when she heard a conversation that stopped her cold. Two women from the other end of Sutter's Creek Road, she knew them slightly. The Holloway sisters, Marjorie and Clara, were talking at the rail not 10 feet away, and they had not seen her come up. "I think August Ford has been courting that Sullivan widow for months," Marjorie Holloway was saying, in the tone of someone delivering well-established information. "Elias Crane told Thomas Davenport that August's been deliberate about every single thing he's brought her. It isn't a coincidence, any of it." "She doesn't seem to know," said Clara, sounding equal parts amused and incredulous. "She doesn't seem to know," Marjorie confirmed. Winifred stood at the wagon rail with her hand on the post and felt the world do a slow, significant rotation around her. She thought about the barbed wire, the firewood, the apple preserves, the farrier, the seed and the plow. The coffee at her table twice a week every week since October. The way he always stayed at the fence line until she invited him through. The way he listened to her talk about Patrick with such genuine quiet care. The way he never pushed or demanded or implied but was simply, consistently, relentlessly there. 6 months, she thought. He had been doing this for 6 months. She walked into the general store and bought her supplies with the automatic competence of a woman who could navigate a transaction, while her mind was entirely elsewhere. And she drove home along Sutter's Creek Road with her hands steady on the reins and her thoughts moving in large, complicated circles. The question she kept coming back to was not how she felt about August Ford. She had some alarming early indicators on that subject that she was not prepared to examine in a moving wagon on a dirt road. The question was what she was going to do with the information that a man she liked and respected, and had been entirely comfortable around for 6 months, had apparently been quietly, patiently, decorously pursuing her with a consistency and thoughtfulness that was, when she allowed herself to see it clearly, rather extraordinary. She arrived home, unhitched the wagon, put the mare away, and stood in the middle of her cabin for a long moment. Then she sat down at her table and thought about Patrick. Not with grief exactly, though grief was still there, quieter now than it had been. She thought about what Patrick would say. Patrick, who had been warm and generous and full of life and who had loved her very much and whom she had loved back. Patrick had always said that the best gift the living could give the dead was to keep living fully. He had said this about other people in their lives who had lost someone, and she had agreed with him, and she did not think he had been wrong. She thought about August Ford's gray eyes and the way he always stopped at the fence line and the particular warmth of his laugh when she said something that caught him off guard. She pressed her hands flat on the table and said out loud to the empty room, "Well." She did not see him for 4 days after that, which was the longest stretch since October. On the 5th day, she saw his horse coming south along the road, and she was so thoroughly unsettled that she went inside and occupied herself with very intensive bread-making for 40 minutes. And when she finally heard him at the fence line, she went to the door and looked out. He was standing at the fence with a small wooden crate and an expression of mild concern. "I wasn't sure if you were home," he said. I've got some canning jars from Clara Holloway, who said she had more than she needed. Clara Holloway. Of course. Winifred was going to have an extremely meaningful conversation with Clara Holloway at the earliest opportunity. "Come in," Winifred said, more abruptly than she intended, and went back inside. He came through the gate and set the crate of canning jars on her table and took off his hat and looked at her. And she realized that she was standing in the middle of her cabin looking at him, as though he were some kind of problem she was trying to solve. "Are you all right?" he asked, with the directness that she had always appreciated and was currently finding somewhat inconvenient. "I went to market in Caldwell on Tuesday," she said. He waited. "I overheard the Holloway sisters talking," she said. Something changed very slightly in his expression. A stillness came into it that hadn't been there before. "They were discussing," Winifred said carefully, "the general opinion that you have been courting me." The silence that followed was one of the more thorough silences she had experienced in recent memory. August Ford looked at her steadily, and she could see him making some kind of internal calculation, and she watched him decide something. "That's a fair characterization," he said. She had expected some form of deflection, a mild disavowal, an explanation, something. The simple directness of his answer was so unexpected that she almost laughed. "For 6 months," she said. "6 months," he confirmed without looking away. She sat down at the table because she needed something solid under her. He stayed where he was, holding his hat, and she noticed with some distant corner of her mind that he looked nervous, which was the first time she had ever seen August Ford look nervous about anything. "You might have mentioned it," she said. "I thought about it," he said, "many times, but you came here to build something of your own. You lost your husband and you came out here alone and you were making something real. And the last thing I wanted to do was make you feel crowded or obligated or like there was some kind of expectation attached to being neighbors." He paused. "And I thought if I was patient and I was honest in what I brought and what I offered, you would either notice or you wouldn't. And if you didn't, it would be a sign that I wasn't reading things right." "You weren't reading things wrong," she said, and then stopped, surprised at herself. He looked at her very carefully. "No." She pressed her hands together on the table and looked out the window at the green summer outside. "I'm not," she started and stopped. "I don't know exactly what I am," she admitted. "I know that I have been comfortable with you in a way I didn't expect to be comfortable with anyone out here. I know that I look forward to—" She stopped again, frustrated with her own honesty. "I look forward to when you come by," she said finally. "And I thought it was just because I valued your company as a neighbor, and evidently I was not thinking about it clearly enough." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her, and they were at the same table where they had had coffee a dozen times, and it felt exactly the same and entirely different at once. "I don't want to push you toward anything," he said. "You've been through a hard thing. I know what it is to lose a person you loved." His voice was careful on that, not performing grief but acknowledging it honestly. "I'm not asking you to replace anything. I wouldn't want you to. I'm just asking if there's a possibility." Winifred looked at him. She looked at August Ford, who had stopped at her fence line for 6 months and never pushed through it uninvited, who had brought useful things and asked for nothing, who had listened to her talk about Patrick with genuine respect for what that loss had meant, who made her feel in the particular way that mattered most that she was someone worth being careful with. "There is a possibility," she said. The smile that crossed his face was different from any other expression she had seen on him, and she understood with a quiet internal thud that it was what he looked like when he was actually deeply relieved. "Then I'll keep coming by," he said. "You'll keep coming by," she agreed, "but with the understanding now that we both know what it means." "That seems fair," he said. They had coffee. They talked about the crops and the cattle market and the railroad, and it was exactly the same as every other conversation they had ever had, except that the air between them was warm in a new way. And when he left that evening and she stood at her door watching him ride north along the road, she felt something open in her chest that she recognized, distantly, as hope. She wrote to Alina that same night. She did not write anything in particular. She wrote about the garden and the summer weather and the market in Caldwell, and then at the very end, almost as an afterthought, she wrote, "I believe I may have made a friend of the sort that turns into something more. Do not make a fuss." Eleanor made an enormous fuss by return post. What followed through the summer was a courtship that was entirely open now, acknowledged and conducted with the same quality of patient care that had characterized its invisible first 6 months. August Ford still came by twice a week on average, but now when he came they often walked the property together in the long summer evenings, the golden light lying flat and warm across the grass, and they talked the way people talk when they are trying to understand each other fully rather than simply sharing information. She learned things she had only known by implication. That his wife, Caroline, had been a quiet and gentle woman who had genuinely loved the ranch and who had died of a hemorrhage 3 days after their son was born, and that the son had not survived either, and that August had spent 2 years after that doing nothing but working until exhaustion made it possible to sleep. That he had come out of those years slowly, rebuilt by the land and the work and the particular patience of people like Elias Crane, who had been with him since the beginning, and who seemed to understand without being told what kind of company a man needed and when. She told him things in return that she had not told anyone else in Kansas. The way Patrick's illness had been so fast that she had not fully believed it was real until it was already over. The guilt she had felt in the weeks after, the irrational guilt of someone wondering if she could have done something differently, even though she knew with her rational mind that a fever was not a moral failure. The way the decision to come to Kansas had felt, in its own strange way, like recovering herself. Not the self she had been before Patrick, but a new self that was built on loss and had come through it and was still standing. August Ford listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and she understood more fully with each conversation that this was simply what he was: attentive, present, the kind of man who showed up and stayed. On a Saturday afternoon in late July, they drove into Caldwell together in his wagon, which was the most deliberate public signal either of them had made about the nature of what was developing between them. And the signal was received and interpreted with great thoroughness by every person in Caldwell who saw them, which appeared to be most of the town's population. Persimmon Hayes at the general store gave them a broad smile and said nothing at all, which was so uncharacteristic that Winifred almost commented on it. Ruth Ann Davenport, who had come in for supplies with her eldest, found Winifred by the fabric bolts while August was at the hardware counter and gripped her arm with the strength of a woman restraining enormous enthusiasm. "I told you," Ruth Ann said, at a volume that was technically a whisper but was not really. "You were right," Winifred said, which cost her something but was also entirely genuine. "You were completely right, and I was not paying adequate attention." Ruth Ann looked so thoroughly satisfied by this that she nearly glowed. "He's a good man," she said seriously, the teasing giving way to something genuine. "The best kind of man, the kind who shows you what he is rather than just telling you." "I know," Winifred said, and she did. She bought a length of blue calico fabric that afternoon because she needed it for a new dress and not for any other particular reason. She made the dress over the following week, and it had nothing to do with August Ford, and she wore it to church the following Sunday. He was sitting 3 rows ahead of her when she came in, and he turned around at the sound of the door, and the expression on his face when he saw her made something run up her spine like warm water, and she sat down in her pew and looked at the hymn book and made a very serious effort to pay attention to the sermon. Afterward, standing in the churchyard in the late morning sunshine with the community gathering in small talking clusters the way they always did on Sundays, he came to stand beside her and said, "That's a fine dress." "Thank you," she said. "I made it this week." "You make everything," he said, not as a comment on her competence but as something approaching wonder, and she found she had no adequate response to that. They walked back to her property together that afternoon, his horse tied to the back of her wagon, and when they reached her fence line, he helped her with the gate in a completely natural way, and they sat on her front step in the warm afternoon and talked until the light turned long and golden, and she thought, this is what it feels like when something is right. Not the same as it had been with Patrick, not a replacement for that, but its own thing entirely, a different shape of rightness that fit the different shape she was now. In August the month, which she privately found amusing given the circumstances, the community had its annual harvest festival in the field behind the Davenport farm. The whole of Sutter's Creek Road and most of the surrounding area came, bringing food and music, and the general festive relief of a summer's work acknowledged and celebrated. Someone brought a fiddle, and someone else brought a harmonica, and a man from the north end of the road had an actual accordion, which was so delightful a surprise that several people applauded simply at the sight of it. There was a flat stretch of packed earth behind the Davenport barn that served as the dancing floor, and the music started before the food was even fully laid out, and the whole thing had the warm, uncomplicated joy of a celebration among people who genuinely knew and liked each other. Winifred had been standing with Ruth Ann and talking about the harvest yields when August appeared at her elbow with the kind of careful deliberateness that she now recognized as his particular style. "Would you dance with me?" he asked. She looked at him. She thought about the fact that she had not danced with anyone since Patrick was alive. "Yes," she said. He was a good dancer. She had not expected this but should have, since he was a man who was competent at everything that required coordination and presence. He moved with a solid, unhurried confidence that made it easy to follow, and they went around the packed earth floor twice in the warm evening light, while the fiddle played something fast and cheerful, and everyone around them was laughing and spinning, and she was smiling in a way that felt new on her face and entirely natural at the same time. When the fast song ended and the accordion player began something slower and more gentle, he looked at her with a question in his expression, and she answered it by staying where she was, and they danced the slow song too, closer than they had stood before, and she was aware of the warmth of his hand at her back and the way she fit comfortably in that space, and the way it did not frighten her at all. She thought, "I am falling in love with this man." She thought this with the calm, certain clarity of a woman who had been falling for some time without acknowledging it, and who had now simply looked down and seen the ground approaching with great inevitability. It did not frighten her. That was the thing that surprised her most. After everything, the loss, the grief, the rebuilding, the long months of being entirely her own, she had expected that opening again to something like this would be terrifying. Instead, it felt like something that had been waiting to be recognized, like a word she had been reaching for that had finally come. After the dance, they sat with Ruth Ann and Thomas Davenport and ate the supper that had been laid out on long tables and talked and laughed, and she noticed that the whole community treated them as a pair with a comfortable naturalness that suggested everyone had been aware of this development far longer than she had. On the drive home in the late summer dark, the stars enormous over the flat Kansas landscape, he said quietly, "I'm glad you came to this valley." "So am I," she said, and meant it entirely. September came in with the particular beauty of early autumn on the plains, the light going golden and angled, the air crisp in the mornings and warm in the afternoons. Winifred's first full harvest was coming in, and it was good, not perfect, not without its difficulties, but genuinely good, and she walked her rows in the morning light and felt the particular satisfaction of having built this from nothing. August was helping her bring in the grain on a Thursday. She had hired 2 young men from town as well, paying them fairly, and August and Elias Crane had both come to work. When she looked across the harvested rows at him and felt so completely full of something that she had to stop what she was doing for a moment and simply stand there in the warm September air. He looked up and saw her looking and raised an eyebrow. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking." "Must be something," he said. "It's a good harvest," she said, which was true as far as it went. That evening, after the hired men had gone and Elias had ridden back to the ranch and the work was done, they sat on her front step again in the cooling evening air, and he had a coffee cup in both hands and was looking out at the harvested field with a comfortable quiet that she had come to know as characteristic of him. "August," she said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I have been thinking it for some time, and I think it's right to say it plainly." He put the coffee cup down on the step beside him and gave her his full attention. "I love you," she said, simply, because she was a woman who said what was true without performing around it. The stillness that came over his face was the same one she had seen in her cabin in June, but deeper now, and she watched him come back from it the way you come back from something that has genuinely caught you by surprise. "Winifred," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like something he had been careful with for a long time. "You don't have to," she started. "I love you," he said over her, with a directness that matched hers. "I have loved you since probably February, when you drove yourself to my ranch to pay me back for the farrier, and told me plainly that you wouldn't be beholden to any man, and I thought, there is someone worth everything." She laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the cooling September evening with their hands together and the harvest lying golden in the field and the stars beginning to appear above the flat Kansas horizon, and everything about it was completely right. He proposed to her in October. He did it on a Sunday morning after church, standing in her yard in the bright autumn light with his hat in his hands and the same expression of careful, patient hope that had been one of the first things she ever noticed about him. He said he wanted to marry her if she would have him. He said he did not want to rush her, and he was not asking because of convention or because of what anyone else thought. He was asking because he wanted to build something with her, and he thought she might want the same. She had known this was coming, had known it for weeks, had been turning it over in the way she turned over any important decision, examining every angle. She had written to Eleanor, who had sent back a letter of such unrestrained joy that it had actually made Winifred laugh until she cried. She had also sat with Patrick's absence for a long, quiet morning, not with grief exactly, but with the particular tenderness she would always have for the man she had first loved, and she had felt, as clearly as she felt anything, that he would have liked August Ford. He would have recognized in him what she had recognized, a man who was genuinely and entirely what he appeared to be. "Yes," she said. He put his hat on the fence post and kissed her for the first time, there in the October morning with the prairie stretching gold and brown to every horizon, and it was warm and careful and entirely right. They were married in December of 1878, on a clear cold day when the sky above Kansas was the deep clean blue of something newly washed. The ceremony was held in the Caldwell church, and it seemed as though everyone on Sutter's Creek Road had come, along with most of the town itself, because August Ford was well liked, and Winifred Sullivan had made, in 1 year, more genuine friends than she had managed in 5 years anywhere else. Ruth Ann Davenport cried with open, uncomplicated happiness. Elias Crane stood up with August and shook everyone's hand afterward with the air of a man for whom this outcome had never been in doubt. Eleanor could not make the journey from Ohio for the winter wedding, but she sent a letter that arrived the week before and was so warm and generous and full of the kind of love that only a sister can carry, that Winifred sat with it in her hands for a long time and felt the particular completeness of someone who is loved from multiple directions at once. The question of the two properties was one they had discussed practically and without drama. August's ranch was the larger operation and the one that needed daily management. Winifred's 40 acres were her own, hard-won and meaningful, and she had been entirely clear that she was not relinquishing them. They resolved it with the same directness that characterized everything between them. She would keep the deed to her 40 acres in her own name and manage them as a productive piece of the combined operation. The field she had planted would be expanded in spring. The cabin would be kept up and used by Elias Crane, who had been living in a bunkhouse on the ranch, and was entirely pleased to have a proper little house. And Winifred would move into the ranch house, which was larger and more established and would, they both agreed, eventually need to be considerably larger still. The ranch house sat on a slight rise north of Sutter's Creek Road, with a view of the surrounding plains that was the most reliably beautiful thing Winifred had seen in Kansas, which was saying something given how consistently beautiful Kansas could be when it wanted to. It had a kitchen, a parlor, 2 bedrooms, and a back porch that faced south over the fields, and she spent her first week there doing to it exactly what she had done to the cabin, cleaning it with thorough intention, rearranging things until they made sense to her, adding the particular marks of someone who was not a visitor but a resident. August watched this process with undisguised delight, moving cheerfully out of whatever room she decided to work in and reappearing with coffee when she looked like she needed it. "You're very good at that," he said one afternoon, watching her reorganize the kitchen shelves. "Someone has to be," she said. "I've been living here for 4 years," he said. "It's never looked like this." "I can tell," she said, and reached past him to put the coffee tin where it actually made sense, which was next to the stove and not at the far end of the room. He laughed and kissed her temple, and she went back to her work, and it occurred to her that this was exactly what contentment felt like. Not the dramatic heights of early love, but the deep, warm, daily satisfaction of being in the right place with the right person. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was a hard one. Kansas winters could be the kind of cold that arrived suddenly and stayed personally, the kind of storms that turned a landscape into something alien and impassable overnight. They were well prepared, because between them they had enough practical experience and stored goods to outlast almost any ordinary winter. But there were stretches of days where the snow was so thick and the wind so aggressive that neither of them ventured out beyond the barn, and they were confined to the ranch house with their books and their conversations and the warmth of the cook stove and each other. Winifred found, to her profound satisfaction, that she and August Ford could be entirely comfortable in each other's company for days at a stretch without any particular event or entertainment. He read almost as much as she did and was willing to talk about what he read, which had been rarer in her experience than it should have been. He had opinions that were thoughtful, and he changed them when presented with better information, which she found more attractive than she had expected. She taught him to play chess, which he had never learned. He was terrible at it initially, with the frustrated concentration of someone who was accustomed to being competent at things, and she beat him thoroughly 6 times in a row and felt not a single moment of guilt about it. "You are an extremely dangerous woman," he said, after the 6th game, staring at the board. "I'm going to win the 7th too," she told him cheerfully. He narrowed his eyes. She did win the 7th. He finally beat her legitimately in March and was so transparently pleased with himself that she laughed until she had to put her hand over her mouth. In the spring of 1879, as the snow melted and the ground came back to itself, Winifred discovered she was expecting a child. She told August on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, having turned the news over in her mind for 3 days and finding it more wonderful each time she looked at it. He looked at her for a long moment after she told him, and she watched something move through his expression that was so complex and so genuine that she reached across the table and took his hand. "All right?" she asked quietly. He nodded, but his hand tightened on hers. She knew he was thinking about Caroline, about how that had ended. She had thought about it too in those 3 days with the clear-eyed honesty she brought to difficult things. "I am healthy," she said. "I am strong, and I have been working hard for 2 years, and I am in good health. And Dr. Marsh in Caldwell is a capable man, and I am not frightened." She looked at him steadily. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, which was honest. "Good," she said. "Being frightened means it matters. It matters enormously, and we're going to be all right." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment. "You are the most remarkable person I've ever known," he said quietly. "I know," she said, and the gentle absurdity of it made them both smile. She wrote to Alina with the news, and Alina wrote back that she was coming to Kansas in the fall. No arguments, end of discussion. And that was so entirely characteristic of Alina that Winifred folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, and felt warm for the rest of the afternoon. The spring planting was the first they did together as a fully combined operation, and it was revelatory in the best possible way. August's ranch was primarily cattle, but the addition of Winifred's 40 acres and her very particular knowledge of grain and kitchen farming expanded what they could do significantly. She managed the crop side of things with the complete authority that he ceded to her without hesitation, and she managed the kitchen and household with the same efficiency, and they worked the cattle side by side in the way that ranch couples had always had to work, because the land did not take days off, and there was always more to do than hours to do it in. Elias Crane, settled happily in the old Sullivan cabin, became one of the most reliable anchors of the whole operation. He was a taciturn man of 40 who had seen most of what the Western Territories had to offer and been impressed by very little of it. But he was openly and unabashedly fond of Winifred, a fact he expressed by showing up consistently and working hard, and occasionally leaving a string of fish from the creek on the porch, without any comment or explanation. The summer of 1879 passed in the particular way that a full and productive summer passes, quickly and slowly at once, measured in the growth of crops and cattle, and the gradual, daily changes of a woman, moving through a pregnancy with the practical matter-of-factness that was simply her nature. She kept working through July and August, doing what she could, handing off the more physical tasks without drama when they became impractical. August was careful with her in a way that was attentive without being smothering, which she appreciated enormously and told him so. "You are not fragile," he said once, when she caught him looking at her with that particular worried expression. "No," she agreed, "but I appreciate that you care." "I will always care," he said simply. She believed him entirely. Alina arrived in September, stepping off the stage in Caldwell with 3 pieces of luggage and the kind of confident energy that made it immediately clear where Winifred's own particular brand of determination came from. Alina was 30, 2 years younger than Winifred, with the same straight auburn hair and the same direct gray eyes, and a personality that was warmer and louder and more immediately social than her sister's. She took to August Ford in approximately 4 minutes, which Winifred found satisfying in ways she could not quite articulate. Watching the two of them, August amused and comfortable, Alina immediately at ease made her feel that everything in her life was lined up correctly. "He's wonderful," Alina told her that same night, in the frank way she said everything. "I know," Winifred said. "And you're wonderful," Alina said. "And you're going to have a wonderful baby and you're going to be completely happy, and I am so glad you came out here even though I was terrified for you the whole time." "You hid it well," Winifred said. "I absolutely did not," Alina said. "Every letter I sent you was full of terror. I just phrased it as practical advice." Their son was born in October of 1879, on a brisk autumn morning with Alina's capable presence in Dr. Marsh from Caldwell, and August pacing the parlor, with the focused anxiety of a man trying very hard to be useful and succeeding mainly in wearing a path in the floorboards. The birth was difficult in the ordinary ways that births are difficult, and entirely safe in all the ways that mattered. And when Winifred heard the baby cry, she felt a relief so enormous it was almost dizzying. And then she felt joy in a wave that she had not expected to be quite that large. August came into the room to find her holding a red-faced, furious, extremely loud infant who was clearly in excellent health, and the expression on his face was something she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and then at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had never seen before. "He looks like a Charles," she said, which she had been thinking for weeks. "Charles Ford," August said, as though testing the weight of it. "That's a good name. Charles Patrick Ford," she said quietly. He looked at her very carefully. "Are you sure?" "Patrick was a good man who wanted something fine for his life," she said. "I think he'd have been glad for his name to go forward into something good." August pressed her hand to his lips and didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. Eleanor stayed through November, helping with Charles and the household with an energy that Winifred found both essential and occasionally exhausting, in the way that loving, energetic sisters always were. She left in the first week of December with a clear promise to return in the spring, and with a warmth toward August Ford that had only grown more genuine with the months of close acquaintance. The winter with Charles was a different winter than any other, interrupted and full, and sometimes very loud, and Winifred navigated the specific chaos of a newborn with the same practical determination she brought to everything. August was up in the night as often as she was, which she had not expected, and which moved her in ways she could not entirely express. He learned very quickly to hold Charles in the specific way that stopped the crying, and he was so unreservedly tender with the baby that it made something in her chest feel permanently full. "You're good at this," she told him one night, watching him walk Charles slowly up and down the kitchen in the lamplight. "He's easier than cattle," August said, deadpan, and she laughed and startled Charles into momentary quiet. By the time spring of 1880 came in, Charles was 5 months old and thoroughly settled into the household's rhythms, and Winifred was back to full operation, planning the spring planting with the enthusiasm of someone who had been thinking about crop rotations through the long winter months and was finally able to do something about them. Her 40 acres had been producing well since the first harvest. She had expanded the grain crop and added a more substantial kitchen garden, and she had begun trading her surplus vegetables and preserved goods in Caldwell with an organized regularity that was quietly beginning to generate a respectable additional income. Several of the women in Caldwell came to her specifically for her preserved goods, which had developed a reputation for quality that she found practically satisfying. The spring also brought a development that Winifred had been quietly watching with concern through the winter months. There was a dispute developing between several of the landowners on Sutter's Creek Road and a cattle company out of Wichita that was attempting to argue claim over a section of land that ran along the east edge of several properties, including, peripherally, August's ranch. The company had lawyers and the kind of money that could sustain a legal argument for a long time regardless of its merits. August came home one March evening with a set expression that she had learned to read as the controlled version of something more complicated. "They're pushing the land claim," he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. She sat across from him and waited. He explained the situation in full, which she appreciated. Some men would have softened it or omitted the worst parts, but he never did that. The Wichita Company had filed a claim in Wichita that was based on a surveying error from 4 years ago, an error that had since been corrected in the county records, but that they were arguing had established a prior claim under the original survey. "Is their legal argument sound?" she asked. "My lawyer in Caldwell says it isn't, but it could drag through the territorial court for a year or more," he said. "It would cost most of the smaller landowners here more than they can afford to fight." Winifred thought about this. She thought about her 40 acres and the fact that she had paid for them legitimately and held a valid deed. She thought about the Holloways and the Davenports and all the people who had built lives on this road. "The county records are correct," she said. "Yes." "Then the correction in the county records is the bedrock of the defense," she said. "Every landowner on this road should pool the cost of one lawyer who works from those corrected records. One shared defense is considerably cheaper than 5 individual ones, and a unified front is considerably harder to push against than isolated objections." He looked at her. "I'll come to the community meeting," she said. She went to the community meeting, which was held at the Davenport farm the following Sunday, and she presented the shared defense idea with the clarity and directness that she brought to any practical problem. And there was some discussion. And then Thomas Davenport said that it was plainly the right approach, and they agreed on it. And Winifred organized the initial fund for legal costs, because organizing things was something she was particularly good at. The legal dispute wound its way through the territorial court over the following months, exactly as predicted, and in the late fall of 1880 it was resolved in favor of the landowners on the basis of the corrected county records, exactly as their Caldwell lawyer had anticipated. The Wichita Company withdrew its claim. The road returned to normal. Winifred made no particular comment on having predicted this outcome correctly. She did note that the shared defense fund had a small remainder after costs were settled, and she organized its distribution back to the contributing landowners with the same efficiency she had applied to collecting it. "You should have been a lawyer," Ruth Ann told her, helping her with the distribution documentation one afternoon. "Lawyers in 1880 are not accepting women to the bar in Kansas Territory," Winifred said practically. "That is a terrible injustice," Ruth Ann said. "It is one of several," Winifred agreed, without particular bitterness. "The answer, as with most injustices one cannot immediately correct, is to do the work through whatever channel is actually available." She finished writing a figure in the ledger. "Which I am doing." Ruth Ann looked at her with sincere admiration. "You are a truly remarkable woman." "You've told me that before," Winifred said. "I'll keep telling you until the territory catches up with what you're capable of," Ruth Ann said. Winifred smiled and finished the ledger. The years on Sutter's Creek Road developed their own rhythm, full and layered and deeply satisfying in the way that a life built deliberately can be. The ranch grew steadily as August managed it with his patient, competent hand, adding to the cattle operation each season in a measured way that kept the quality high and the risk manageable. Winifred's crop operation expanded to the point where she had regularized supply agreements with 3 businesses in Caldwell for her grain and preserved goods. Charles grew into a small, determined person who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's absolute refusal to let any task defeat him. By the time he was 2, he was following August around the ranch with the earnest focus of someone who intended to understand how everything worked, which August found transparently delightful. In the spring of 1882, Winifred told August she was expecting again. This time the fear in his expression was there but smaller, already tempered by the evidence of her history and her health and the particular competence with which she managed everything, including, apparently, the business of having children. "A girl this time, maybe," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Or another boy. Either way." "Either way," he agreed. It was indeed a girl born in the autumn of 1882 named Margaret Eleanor Ford, the Eleanor being for Winifred's sister who received the news via letter with such an audible joy that Winifred could practically hear her from Ohio. Margaret arrived with an expression of concentrated focus that made Dr. Marsh laugh, and say he had never seen a newborn who looked quite so purposeful, and Winifred looked at the small face and felt that the purposefulness was entirely appropriate. Charles, at nearly 3, examined his new sister with enormous gravity, and then went outside to tell Elias Crane about her, which was as complete an acceptance as could reasonably be expected. Eleanor made the journey from Ohio that winter, and this time she brought a man she introduced as her husband, James Alcott, who had married her in September without any particular advance notice to anyone, which was entirely characteristic of Eleanor, and which Winifred found not at all surprising. James was a tall, mild-tempered schoolteacher who seemed genuinely delighted by Kansas, and by his sister-in-law, and by August Ford, and who was so obviously and thoroughly in love with Eleanor that Winifred felt completely at ease with him within the first afternoon. The winter of 1882 was one of the warmest Winifred could remember in Kansas, though she had been told not to trust that The warm winters were often followed by the harshest springs. She and Alina sat on the back porch in the thin December sunlight, with Margaret wrapped between them and Charles running the yard with some enterprise that involved several sticks and a great deal of invention. And Alina talked about Ohio and James, and whether they might have children soon. And Winifred talked about the expanded operation, and the legal dispute's long-term implications for how the road was organized. And they talked the way sisters talk when they have not been together enough and are making up for the deficit. "Are you happy?" Alina asked at one point, not as a pleasantry but with genuine curiosity, the way she always asked the important questions. Winifred looked out at the winter light on the Kansas plains, at the wide gold and brown of it, at the clear sky, at Charles conducting his stick-based enterprise with maximum seriousness. "Yes," she said. "Completely and entirely yes." Alina squeezed her hand and they sat in the thin, warm winter sun and let the afternoon settle around them. By 1883, the community on Sutter's Creek Road had grown and shifted and settled into something that felt permanent and self-sustaining. Several new homesteads had been established, younger families who had come west with the same combination of determination and hope that had brought Winifred 5 years earlier. The road had a social fabric now, regular community meetings and Sunday gatherings, and the harvest festival that had been a tradition since before she arrived, all of it woven together by the daily proximity of people who depended on each other. Winifred was on the committee for the community school that the county was establishing, having been asked by 3 separate people including Ruth Ann and Thomas Davenport and Persimmon Hayes himself, who had opinions about education, and felt that Winifred Sullivan Ford was the right person to make sure those opinions were properly represented. The school was built in the spring of 1883, a proper small schoolhouse at the crossroads, and the teacher they hired from the East was a young woman named Miss Adeline Price, who was 22 and serious and very good at her work, and who settled into the community with the quick adaptability of someone who had come ready to stay. Charles started at the school that fall and came home each day with the vibrating energy of someone who had been given access to an enormous number of things to know and found all of them interesting. And Winifred sat with him at the kitchen table every evening going over his lessons with the deep pleasure of someone who loved learning, and found the extension of that love into the next generation to be one of the most satisfying things she had ever done. August sat with them sometimes, listening more than participating, and occasionally asking Charles questions that pushed the boy to think further than the lesson itself, and she watched her son's face when he worked through something difficult and got to the answer and thought, "This is what Patrick meant when he said build something, not just land and cattle and grain. This." The summer of 1883 brought a dry spell that stretched into drought conditions through July and August, the worst the area had seen in several years. The creek ran low, the wells needed monitoring, and the crops needed more careful water management than the ordinary season. It was hard work through a hard month, and the whole community pulled together in the particular way that shared hardship compelled people to sharing water from the deeper wells, managing livestock numbers, making decisions together that none of them could have made as well alone. August managed the ranch through the drought with the steady competence that had always characterized him, making decisions that were careful rather than panicked, losing some of the cattle in the hottest weeks, which was painful and unavoidable, and keeping the rest. Winifred managed the crop side with a precision that minimized the loss to a level that was survivable, and set them up for the following season, rather than setting them back irrecoverably. By September, when the rains returned and the plains began their slow recovery, they held each other on the back porch in the first real rain, and felt the enormous relief of it. And he pressed his lips to her hair, and she leaned into him, and they were quiet for a long time in the sound of the rain on the dry land. "This valley keeps testing people," she said finally. "It keeps finding out who's worth keeping," he said. She looked up at him. "Are we worth keeping?" "We absolutely are," he said, with the direct certainty that she had loved from the very beginning of knowing him. The years continued to build on each other with the satisfying accumulation of a life being constructed thoughtfully. In 1884, Winifred organized a women's reading group in Caldwell that met twice a month, bringing together women from several different properties and backgrounds to discuss books and ideas and the practical business of their lives, with the frank intelligence that women applied to everything when given space to do so. Ruth Ann Davenport was a founding member, naturally, and Ruth Ann's enthusiasm was such that within 6 months the group had doubled and had to find a larger meeting place. Persimmon Hayes gave them the back room of the general store on the relevant evenings, and Winifred organized a small lending library from donated books, and Miss Adeline Price from the school became an enthusiastic participant, and the group became one of the most reliable fixtures of the community's intellectual life. August, when she told him about the group's growing membership, said, "I am not even slightly surprised." "Is that a compliment?" she asked. "It is the highest possible compliment," he said. Charles was 5 in 1884 and Margaret was 2, and the house was full in the particular noisy, complicated, deeply satisfying way of a house with young children in it. Elias Crane came to dinner on Sunday with the comfortable frequency of family, sitting at the table with the solidity of someone who had known the household longer than anyone, telling Charles stories about cattle drives and prairie, whether with a delivery so dry and deadpan that Winifred often couldn't tell if he was telling the truth or inventing something, which she suspected was exactly the effect he intended. The fall of 1884 brought Aliner's letter with news that she was expecting her first child in the spring, and this letter produced such genuine joy in Winifred that she read it aloud to August at the dinner table, and he raised his coffee cup in a toast, and Charles looked between them with the interested confusion of a 5-year-old at the edge of something he didn't quite follow. "Your Aunt Aliner is having a baby," Winifred told him. He considered this. "Like Margaret?" he asked. "Something like that," she said. He nodded with the gravity of someone filing away information for future consideration and went back to his supper. In 1885, on a clear spring morning that was so beautiful it felt deliberate, Winifred was walking the south fence line of her original 40 acres, still hers, the deed still in her name, the field still producing reliably, and she stopped at the point where she could see, to the north, the roof of the ranch house on its slight rise, and to the south, the road curving toward Caldwell, and to every other direction, the prairie lying open and gold-green in the spring light. She had been here 7 years. She had come alone with 2 trunks and a deed and a grief, and she had built a farm and a home and a family and a community, and she was standing on her own land in her own valley, and the life around her was so full it sometimes made her breath catch. She thought of Patrick, as she still did, with love and with the particular complex tenderness of memory. She hoped, wherever people went, that he could see this, that he knew his dream had been honored, had been built, had become real. She walked back along the fence line toward the ranch house, and when she came into the yard, August was coming out of the barn with Charles on his shoulders, the boy's hands gripping his father's hair with cheerful disregard, and August was pretending not to notice the hair pulling with a stoicism that was so theatrical it was clearly a game between them. He saw her and smiled, and it was the same smile he had had in her cabin when she said there was a possibility, the one that showed what he looked like when he was truly, deeply relieved and happy, except that now it was simply his ordinary everyday expression, and she saw it every day, and it never stopped doing the thing it had always done to the place just behind her sternum. "Good walk," he called. "Perfect," she said. He set Charles down, and the boy ran immediately toward the chicken coop on whatever mission occupied him, and August came across the yard to where she had stopped, and she looked up at him in the clear spring light. "I was thinking," she said, about what a strange thing it is," she said, "that I came out here entirely alone and ended up here." He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had valued from the very first. "Not strange," he said. You were always going to end up exactly somewhere like this. You just had to get here." She took his hand and they walked back toward the house. And inside they could hear Margaret waking from her nap, the preliminary sounds of a toddler deciding to engage with the world. And Charles was doing something at the chicken coop that involved a great deal of commentary directed at the chickens. And the spring light lay warm across the porch where they had sat on so many evenings, and everything about it was completely and entirely right. That evening, after supper, with the children settled and the house quiet in the particular warm quiet of an ending day, they sat at the kitchen table together. The table where she had made him coffee 12 times when she thought he was being neighborly. The table where she had told him she loved him. The table where their family had sat through every meal of 5 years of marriage. And he was reading, and she was writing a letter to Alina, and the lamp threw soft light across everything. And outside the Kansas night was calm and huge and full of stars. She looked up from her letter and watched him read, the familiar angles of his face in the lamplight, the small lines that the years and the sun had added, the way he turned a page with the same care he brought to everything. He looked up and found her watching him. "Writing to Alina?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "What are you telling her?" She looked at the letter, at the words she had written about the spring planting and Charles and Margaret and the reading group and the drought recovery, and all the ordinary, extraordinary details of a full and good life. "Everything," she said. He smiled and went back to his book, and she went back to her letter, and the lamp burned warm between them, and Winifred Sullivan Ford sat at her kitchen table in Kansas in the spring of 1885, and wrote about her life with the steady, grateful hand of someone who understood, all the way down to her bones, what it meant to have built something real. Outside, the prairie night stretched to every horizon, wide and dark and full of possibility, exactly as it had been when she first arrived, except that now it was familiar and beloved and entirely home. She finished the letter and sealed it and set it with the others that would go to Caldwell on Thursday, and she blew out the lamp and went upstairs to the room where her husband was already asleep with the complete unconscious ease of someone whose conscience was entirely clear. And she lay down beside him in the dark and listened to the particular silence of the Kansas night and felt it, the fullness of it, the settled, permanent, deeply rooted happiness of a life that had been chosen and built and lived with intention. She thought, this is what Patrick meant, all of it. This is exactly what he meant. And she let the thought be there, complete and good and without grief now, just the pure clear love of it, and she closed her eyes, and the prairie night held them all in its enormous quiet, and everything that had needed to be built had been built, and everything that had needed to be found had been found, and Winifred Sullivan Ford slept.